Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. You're listening to a show that is all about ideas, about the search for wisdom and knowledge through conversation. My guests all have something to say and have the credentials to say it persuasively. Here, the conversation continues. Thank you for joining me for Season 7 of the Optimistic Curmudgeon. I want to thank America's Christian Credit Union for sponsoring today's episode. Human life is precious at every stage, no matter what the secular narrative may say. Our friends over at America's Christian Credit Union understand this, and that's why they are partnering with the pro-life diaper company Every Life to get diapers to moms who are choosing life. From now until January 31, 2025, ACCU will donate a box of Every Life diapers to a Christian Pregnancy Resource Center for every new member who opens a checking account using promo code EVERY. That's promo code EVERY with all caps. I know the idea of switching banks can seem like a hassle, but right now is the time to partner with people who support and uphold our values, not work against them like so many banks do. Plus, the EVERY promo code will also get you a $100 bonus new member bonus. Learn more at americaschristiancu.com/every. That's americaschristiancu.com/every. And you can find that link in the show description for this episode. And now, this week's interview on the Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herron. Today, my guest is Tyler O'Neill, managing editor of the Daily Signal and the author of the forthcoming book, author of his first book, Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center. His new book is coming out in January, and it's available now for pre-order. It's the one we'll be discussing today, The Woketopus, the dark money cabal manipulating the federal government. Tyler, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Josh.
I'm really excited we get to catch up and have a conversation. You've become something of a crazy book author. I think you're already on your second book. I don't know if I have any other friends from my time at Hillsdale who are on book 2. It's quite impressive.
Yeah. Well, I hope the clip can speed up a little bit. 5 years is a bit of time, but this one I'm really excited about. And the first one was a big passion of mine, and this one I think I've really exposed a lot.
Well, let's get to it. I was hoping we could start with the sort of the story behind the story. How did you get interested in tracking? I don't know if this is even the right word, but I'm thinking of this as the deep state, some kind of permutation of the administrative state. Maybe you could also help with some definitions. But how did you get into this project, and what was your process like for it?
Yeah, so it is the deep state. I think that's the correct way to describe it. And I've been kind of running into a lot of these issues in my reporting over the last few years. My basic thesis is, you have Project 2025, which many on the left like to demonize as some sort of attempt to take over the federal government. Well, essentially what Project 2025 is making the administrative state more accountable to the people's elected president and kind of reining in the deep state. And of course, there's a lot in Project 2025. When you have a 900-page book, there are some things in there that you and I may not always agree with. But the basic project of making the administrative state more accountable to the people's elected representatives, whether that be the president or whether that be the Congress, I think that is an extremely important issue. I mean, we're having this conversation on Constitution Day, when I think it is a natural time to note that the way that our government works today is not the way that it was intended to work. And so I think this change, this shift away from representational government to bureaucrats seizing power, writing the rules by which we must live, and really getting their cues from a vast apparatus, what I call this dark money cabal, the Woketopus, where you have all these nonprofit agencies, all these nonprofit organizations that are colluding with federal agencies to write rules and regulations, sometimes circumventing the president himself. And I mean, we see this really in a big way on the issue of Israel, where even under Biden, we talk about the deep state under Trump all the time, and we should, because that was when the administrative state really reared its ugly head and said, no, we're not going with the people's elected president. But under Biden, you had a president who would stand up there and unashamedly say, we're fighting for Israel. We think Israel has a right to defend itself. And in the back seat, in the administrative state, you had all these bureaucrats who started sending dissent cables in the State Department. They started working behind the scenes to undermine the president of the United States, even though they're under him, under the Constitution, and even though, for the most part, the Woketopus aligns with President Biden on pretty much everything. But when it came to Israel, at least his rhetoric is very different from where a lot of these activists want to go. And so that was one of the eye-opening things. The other eye-opening thing was, of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center. I've been following them, long before I wrote my first book. And then I saw that under Biden, the administrative state was taking their cues from this discredited left-wing smear factory. And I was wondering why. And the more research I did, the more digging I looked into, I saw that the SPLC is one of many instances where you have this left-wing organization that is infiltrating the administrative state in ways that they'd never allow a conservative organization to do, and in ways that undermine Americans, undermine, in the SPLC's case, our free speech culture, which I think they're really eroding by demonizing conservatives, mainstream conservative and Christian groups, and sometimes not even conservative or Christian, just people who disagree with their agenda, and putting them on this map with the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, that's certainly a really interesting conflux of issues. I'm sure we can, and hopefully we'll be able to look at those kind of a little more piecemeal as we get into our conversation today. Just in case any listeners or viewers are scratching their heads at that phrase, the administrative state, I want to direct you back to 3 years ago on September 29th, 2021. I published an episode. This is season 1, episode 9 with Don Devine. We titled that episode, "The Administrative State is a Bureaucratic Failure." And it sounds like you would agree with the title, Tyler. But the administrative state is such an interesting thing to consider, the deep state, on Constitution Day, because, of course, the Constitution has it's written as a series of articles that are trying to balance different strands of government against each other to prevent any one group from really taking over the others. And then, but even then, each of those groups is representing other delegated authority. So the founders were very attuned to the idea that we should not have any one group be able to take over the country. But if I'm following your line of reasoning, it sounds like that's exactly what's happened. And it's far, far away from actual elected officials having the authority to make decisions, but instead it's people who've applied for jobs perhaps 40 years ago that have now risen through the bureaucratic ranks, and they just make decisions, and they sort of stand alongside and in some cases on top of actual laws and policy. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So the administrative state is, it's these alphabet soup agencies. So technically they fall under the president, under the executive branch. They are ways of applying the law. But Congress has written a lot of these intentionally vague laws, such as the Clean Air Act, where essentially Congress says, oh, we want to have clean air. You, Environmental Protection Agency, you give us clean air. And so Congress still retains the power of the purse. So Congress could theoretically, if it wanted to, defund the EPA and say, look, you're so far outside your mission that we're taking away your money and you can't do anything. Of course, it'd be interesting to see if that were to happen, what the Federal Reserve would do, what the president would do, especially if Congress and the president were at odds in that situation. But Congress still has that authority, at least on paper. When it comes to the actual operation of the law, though, the EPA has all of this power, and it's largely unchecked. Congress very rarely, occasionally you'll get a legislator, somebody in Congress, makes a call to the EPA on behalf of one constituent who's struggling with the EPA's excessive rules. And Congress will say, hey, can you make an exception here? And then often the EPA will make the exception. This this was something we learned way back. I don't know if you had Porteous for Constitution 101.
Oh, I had Craig.
But Porteous had this wonderful document that we read on this that explained exactly how it works and why it's really a you scratch my back, I scratch yours situation. Because the congressman gets to go to the people and say, hey, look, I'm fighting for you against this evil executive agency. But the congressman can also say, hey, I voted for clean air. And then he can wash his hands if the regulation is too onerous. Meanwhile, the agency gets all the power. It gets a little bit demonized, but the agency doesn't really care about how it's perceived by the public. It cares about whether it can make the rules. And a lot of these bureaucrats make the rules in such a way that they later can go into either lobbying or the private sector and use the rules that they created to make a lot of money for themselves. And of course, it all gets worse because if you live in Washington, D.C., you realize that it's expensive to live here. And the people on Capitol Hill who write the laws that are shifting this authority are often staffers who are only a couple of years out of college. They quickly realize that they can't make a lot of money on the Hill, but they can make a lot of money by going into lobbying. So they spend some time on the Hill and they work odd jobs in the evenings. And they are the ones who are making the real laws. And then they switch to the private sector when they have the connections and when they have the expertise to cash in on it. So you have all of these negative, perverse incentives for people to create bad laws, leave bad laws in place, have a regulatory state that far exceeds its boundaries. And then, not have Congress, because Congress is often deadlocked, not have Congress really resolve these issues. And then, of course, you have congressmen on both sides continually able to run against the system by saying, oh, the system is unjust. The system is unjust. And it's like, well, who has authority over that system? And if you wanted to, you could get rid of these agencies that are causing all of these problems. But you don't because you don't want to. And I mean, most of the people don't want to. There are some legislators who do want to. And then, of course, you have the people who say, oh, we should get rid of the Department of Education. And the left freaks out because they're like, oh, no, this is the end of the world. Well, the Department of Education is largely a grant-making institution. The only main thing that they do besides a lot of grant making is enforce Title IX. And there we can open a whole new can of worms in our discussion.
Well, before we get to the Department of Ed or Title IX, let's go back to your title. Just walk us through what you're going for with Woketopus. I mean, I'm assuming there's a combination of woke and octopus, but what do you have going on here in this title?
Yeah. So as I say, the Woketopus, the dark money cabal manipulating the federal government. And what we see, what I go through is, and you have this chart that I sent you, so it kind of encapsulates it at the top.
It's too dense for anybody to make out from this image, but I'll just hold them up so they know that I do in fact have this chart.
At the top, you have the funding groups, the George Soros Open Society Foundations, the Tides Foundation. These are big left-wing donors that shovel money around to promote left-wing causes. And oftentimes they're funded by, the elites in our society. And they push radical leftist ideologies. And so you have the funders at the top. Then they're giving money to the woke nonprofits. And the woke nonprofits then influence the federal government. And so it's this big, this vast influence campaign. And there are a lot of different signs. And so I think the chart is terrifying. It exposes how big this campaign is. But also, I think that chart and my book in general only scratch the surface of what this influence campaign really looks like. Let's
get into some of those specifics. You already started getting into education. Let's go there. Walk us through now. Let me just ask you to imagine I'm going to describe a friend of mine who hopefully won't realize he's being described. But this particular friend tends to assume that neutrality is still happening, and if anyone is up to no good, it's the people on the right. And he's sort of completely oblivious to the fact that anyone on the left might actually abuse power or use influence in weird ways. So, with that person in mind, what kinds of things are happening in education?
Yeah. So my education chapter focuses on two large issues. One of them is COVID. And of course, that opens a huge can of worms. And the other one is the giveaway, the student loan debt giveaway. And so essentially both of these issues I think are actually really important for your friend, for my friends who think similarly, where, we all lived through the COVID pandemic. We all, kind of wish that we could forget about it and return to life as normal beforehand. But I think it's important to remember that we had this long period where, and I really focused this chapter on teachers' unions because I think they're often a driving force on this. I looked at the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. They shovel money so they do two different things in this book. They're part of the funding apparatus where they take the dues, the hard-earned dues that teachers get in this country, and they take those dues and shift them into these far left causes that are then lobbying the federal government. And then also the teachers unions themselves lobby the federal government. So, on the very first day in office, President Joe Biden had Randy Weingarten and Rebecca Pringle, who are the heads of the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, respectively, to the White House to celebrate that they would have more impact on this administration. And what we have are smoking gun emails showing that Randy Weingarten had early access to and influence upon some of the school reopening guidance during COVID out of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And so one of the really bizarre things that we saw through the COVID pandemic is that early on in the pandemic, I remember writing articles about this in April and May of 2020, where we had early data showing that the pandemic was most deadly for those who were elderly and had pre-existing conditions. It was not deadly for children. It was not spread by children. This is wonderful news if you want schools to return to normal in the fall of 2020. But we didn't have that conversation. In fact, we barely had the conversation of them returning to normal in the spring of 2021 or even the fall of 2021. And when Biden won his election in 2020, he promised that schools would be open by 100 days into his administration. And then, interestingly, Jen Psaki stood in front of the press and said, no, what Biden was promising was that 100% of schools would have a hybrid model where at least one day a week they would be coming into school. And, her reinterpretation was worlds removed from what Biden had actually promised. And so we had teachers' unions fighting to keep kids out of schools, ostensibly to protect the teachers. But in reality, I think it was a shakedown for money, essentially, from the federal government, where the teachers' unions were saying, we're going to hold kids back and we're going to deny kids the education they need until we get certain guarantees from the government. And they did. They got a lot of money that was shoveled their way. And then finally, they were more in favor of opening schools. But they also used opening schools as this bargaining chip. It's interesting to see when the Republicans in Congress faulted Randy Weingarten for this. She pointed to a document where she said, I wanted to have a school reopening plan back in the summer of 2020. I was arguing for this. So I looked up that document, and it turns out, that document is a very partisan political document where they're saying, not only am I condemning Trump, who is the sitting president at this point, but I'm also demanding that we shovel a lot of money into these completely unrelated to education expenses that, are going to reverse anti-racism, that are going to reverse all sorts of other, leftist agenda items. So I think it was very clear from the outset that this was a marketing tool, a political, weapon, not a good faith effort to reopen schools and get them into the classrooms where they belong.
Yeah, I remember a lot of that. I mean, that it was very. I mean, it was relatively transparent, even like as that was happening. That'd be, yeah. Well, let's jump to one other, maybe two other issues there, particularly before we move on to a different area of your book. What did you see? What do you trace going on with LGBTQ issues?
Oh my, what do I not trace?
I mean, you one of your favorite chapter titles I really liked was the transgender administrative state. I thought that was a great turn of phrase.
I got that idea from the Heritage Foundation's Oversight Project, which has an article by that name where they had gotten a lot of these documents that I cite in the book, where all aspects of the administrative state had been redefined and shifted in favor of LGBTQ issues. Mm-hmm. And, it was fascinating to trace this back because it makes sense that Biden, whose campaign was always super LGBTQIA, WTF, whatever, he would champion these issues. He'd long been doing that, redefining all sorts of things. And it's bizarre to see a nominal Catholic sign up to all these things, because I don't know if he's read the Catechism of the Catholic Church recently.
No, there's no way.
It's not exactly in keeping with what our friends on the other side of the Tiber actually believe. But, Biden has signed up to all these things. But what I found interesting was that one of the most influential organizations in this sphere is the Human Rights Campaign. Mm-hmm. And the Human Rights Campaign, I think we'll remember Target and Bud Light from last year, where they, lost huge amounts of market share because they were pandering to the LGBTQ lobby. And so I looked at this, and, one of the main reasons they were pandering was because the Human Rights Campaign has this corporate equality index where they rate all sorts of companies on, I think they have a 100% score sort of thing. And
yeah, I was actually reading a little bit about this morning, because a lot of this is in there's a lot of stuff about this in Katie Faust's new book coming out in a couple of weeks, Pro-Child Politics. There's a chapter in there, particularly I was reading this morning about both Disney and Paramount have a 100 score on that very index that you're describing.
Yeah.
Yeah. All that to say, yeah. Keep going.
Bud Light and Target both had 100 scores. And then what happened was they leaned in, they lost market share. Suddenly Bud Light's no longer the top selling beer. Suddenly Target loses a lot of its customers, and they rush. They're like, oh no, we realize we've done something wrong. Let's try to bring people back if we can. Let's distance ourselves from Dylan Mulvaney. And, the Human Rights Campaign does not forget. And so if you look at their scores today, both of them are marked down because they made the mistake of dialing back their LGBTQ activism to try to bring customers back. And customers don't always come back when they see these things. And recently we've had a whole slew of companies pulling out of the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index because they realized that, HRC was selling them a bill of goods. They thought there was no downside to being associated with this organization. As it turns out, there is a big downside among a lot of American consumers. But the Biden administration hasn't gotten the memo. And so the Human Rights Campaign came out with this document outlining all the policies they want. I went through the document, and more than 3/4 of that document is fulfilled in Biden administration policy. Not only that, but the Human Rights Campaign has a long track record of many meetings with the White House and having some of their staff go over to the administration. So what you often see, and I mean, this wasn't as strong with HRC as it is with many of these groups, but you'll see a bureaucrat, who champions some radical idea. Often it's on climate, some radical climate idea. Then there's a change in government, or the bureaucrat just is tired of Washington, goes and works for one of these Woketopus nonprofits, becomes a president, grand poobah, whatever, impacts things from outside the administrative state, and then returns to the administrative state afterward. And so you have this revolving door. I call it the green revolving door. Anyway, that's another topic. But the Human Rights Campaign, you get ICE and the Department of Homeland Security telling agents that they need to refer to illegal aliens by their preferred pronouns. Right. You get, the rewriting of laws on Title IX and on all across the federal government to favor transgender, all the LGBT stuff. But in particular, I focus on transgender ideology because I think that's the main, first off, it's the easy thing for everybody to understand. This is insane. You're denying basic biology. This isn't a live and let live issue. This is you will all believe what we believe and live as though I can change from being male to female whenever I want to. And so that ideology is entrenched in very concrete ways throughout the administration. And I think Human Rights Campaign is the number one influencer as to why.
So, well, let me ask you this then. Everything you're saying, I remember I tend to watch these kind of stories relatively closely. Like, I recognize a lot of these elements from the last few years. How do you go about proving causation rather than correlation? Because I can imagine an easy response to everything you've said so far is like, okay, well, you might have seen 3/4 of these policies in a Human Rights Campaign document, and those policies line up with the Biden administration. Like, how do you prove that the HRC was the influence, or is the Biden campaign just so ideologically aligned with all these groups that they just came up to the same conclusions simultaneously? Or is that even a question that you're addressing? Like, how do you handle the causality question?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in certain cases, the causality is clear. One of my chapters focuses on Demos, which is an organization that former President Barack Obama actually early served on the board of. And Demos not only has people all throughout the administration, but they also wrote a document that is almost word for word the same as President Biden's elections executive order that he issued in 2021, right after HR 1, their big, bill to federalize elections. Right after that failed, he comes in with this executive order. And then it's like the executive order is like the order exactly written by Demos. And then they have a listening session where they bring in Demos and they bring in all sorts of external groups. And then, of course, all these agencies that have plans to implement the executive order. Well, guess who they're working with to implement the executive order? Demos. And so there are very clear causation situations like that lead me to believe there's more causation than meets the eye in the other situations. But when it comes to the Human Rights Campaign, there isn't as much causation on all of the nitty-gritty policies. However, what we do have, and this was really shocking when it happened, was the Biden administration came out with a statement where they said, we do not support transgender surgeries for minors or something like that. And the Human Rights Campaign launched a pressure campaign pushing them to change the statement. And then not only did they change the statement, but then the Human Rights Campaign sent out a fundraising email saying to all their donors, look, we made concrete impact here, and we need to continue to do this kind of thing. And I'm just like, okay, I don't have drop dead to rights evidence that every single thing that Human Rights Campaign wanted was shepherded by Human Rights Campaign in the administrative state. But what I do have is far more than enough evidence to suspect that there's more. And part of the point of this book is to lay out what I've got, to remind people of all these stories they might have forgotten, to say, look, this influence campaign is happening. I can't prove that it's happening on everything, but hopefully this is a springboard from which people can continue to ask questions and come back and say, all right, why exactly did you embrace this policy? Was it because the Human Rights Campaign was calling for this? And given the Human Rights Campaign's clout, I mean, Biden and Harris and all these people have spoken at the Human Rights Campaign's events. It's not exactly a secret that they're connected to this organization. I mean, most of this is not like, I'm not some crackpot theorist saying without any proof that there's somebody controlling the strings behind the federal government. All the stuff is clearly out there. I just have a few new pieces of information, and I have the broad connections that really bring the message together.
Well, I mean, that makes sense to me. I don't ask the question about causality to like try and poke a hole in your book. I mean, just that I suspect that's the question that viewers would be thinking. It's like, okay, these sound like a lot of scatter plot spots. So help connect the dots that way. But that really does make sense. I mean, it reminds me so much of Megan Basham's book. Like, in this sense, like I read her book. And that's the book Shepherds for Sale. If any viewers are curious, I reviewed it for the Acton Institute. And it's I generally liked her book. And the only thing I really dinged her on was this exact question of correlation versus causation. But already her writing that book has started to have the same effect that I think you said you wanted to have, where I think more people are starting to ask questions about where is the money for this church project coming from that just seemed to appear out of nowhere. Why is someone willing to fund this? Like, oh, we're inviting that person in. He's connected to this group. Wait a minute. That doesn't quite seem to jive with our denomination. Like, more people are asking those questions in a way that they haven't been, I think, in the last couple of years. So I hope your book does have that effect, because it does seem like something that ought to be deeply concerning to the average American, because these policies do massively affect the way that we live.
Yeah, no, they do. And I like the comparison. I've written my book based a lot on some of the experience, some of the things that were uncovered by the Capital Research Center's President Scott Walter, who wrote a book on Arabella Advisors. And I also really appreciate Meg Basham's book, because I think conservatives can't ask enough the question, where is the money for this coming from? Because in so many cases, and I love the way Meg uncovers it. It's like there are a couple things I wish she hadn't said, ways of phrasing things. But in general, like the way that this climate alarmist agenda, the way that, transgenderism, all these things are being pushed into the church, which is the last place they should be. And, it's not to say she wasn't always taking a position on these things, but in my book, I do generally take the position that many of these policies are bad for America. And I try to lay out, like, because I'm ready for a lot of the hard questions. So when you ask, can you prove causation? I'm ready for that. If you ask, what about Project 2025? What about the Heritage Foundation? They want to impact the federal policy too. And I say, yes, I don't have a problem with people supporting causes they believe in, and then those people trying to influence the administrative state. What I have a problem with is when that influence is negative for our country, when it goes around Congress, when it undermines the way that our Constitution is meant to work. And so I draw a very clear distinction between what I see the Woketopus doing and what I think Project 2025 would do if it were to be implemented.
Well, maybe this is a good point to go back to your graph, and I'm gonna
if my intern is doing his job right, this is his audio and visual cue to insert the graph into the screen. So hopefully when people watch the stable recording, they're now seeing this beautiful chart on there. Beautiful is maybe a bit much for this chart because it's a tangled mess. And I don't say that as a discredit to your graphic design skills or whoever made this for you, but I mean, we've got 8 funding sources at the top. 7 and then 5 different groups or causes in the middle. And then we got a whole bunch of governmental agencies down here at the bottom. And it would take me a long time to go through and trace with every color in a colored pencil set, like which lines are going to what. So is the complexity of this intentional to make it hard to track the money?
Well, so yes, in terms of the actual thing, in terms of what I describe as the Woketopus, the complexity does make it hard to track the money. And what we see time and time again, one of the big funders is this group called Arabella Advisors. And what Arabella Advisors, and they're actually not the funder, sorry. Arabella Advisors is a for-profit company that created different nonprofits through which donors can give money, and then that money gets redirected to causes that the donors may not want to be seen as supporting. So they have these pass-through organizations that are essentially designed to hide where these organizations are getting their money. And, Arabella is not the first network of nonprofits to do this. The Tides Foundation, which is one of the big other figures in my book, has been doing this for decades. And what's interesting is they'll go through, and I have a whole chapter on a group called Governing for Impact, where Governing for Impact began as a side project of one of the Arabella nonprofits. And it was part of the nonprofit. It was called Fiscally Sponsored Organization. It didn't become independent until fairly recently. And so what this enabled was that they didn't have to report things to the IRS. They didn't have to say where their money was going because they weren't a 501c3. The parent organization had to, but they didn't. And so one of the big organizations I talk about in the anti-Israel chapter is the Tides Foundation has a fiscal sponsor called Palestine Legal. And Palestine Legal exists to provide legal defense services for all of these people who get arrested in anti-Israel riots, who they're chanting, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They're harassing Jews. Sometimes they're violating laws. They're going into congressional office buildings and lying down. And then Palestine Legal is ready to offer the defense. And Palestine Legal is a clear, direct connection between the left's dark money network and the boots on the ground anti-Israel protesters.
Now, this may be an odd question, but I mean, so from what you're describing, it sounds pretty clear that this only exists on the left. There's not a corresponding right-wing network of like super secret super donors who are like funding, I don't know, the Defense of Marriage Act or something like. No. So why is this happen on the left but not happen on the right?
So there are a few organizations that do somewhat similar things on the right. This is the kind of so they often talk about the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and the funding that he does in these really conspiratorial ways. There are a few pass-through groups on the right, but for the vast majority of the organizations on the right, they are only dark money in the sense that nonprofits don't have to disclose exactly who their donors are. Like the Heritage Foundation is technically a dark money enterprise because it keeps its donors hidden. So is the Center for American Progress. So is all these groups. You can use dark money as a term to smear many different people. What I talk about in this case is dark money of an elevated stature, like the Arabella nonprofits. And there are a couple, so like there were good research on this. The left is constantly talking about the right's dark money operations, but the left's dark money operations are many times as big. And when you look at the actual numbers from the 2020 cycle, the left spent at least twice as much as the right in terms of this influence campaign. So it's not that this doesn't exist at all on the right. It's just that the left is far better organized because, I mean, America's elites are kind of on one side of the political spectrum these days.
Okay. So this may be beyond where your book is going, but are you suggesting that either the right needs to get better at this, or that this kind of super dark money funding should be stopped?
I don't advocate for getting rid of the super dark money funding. I do advocate for exposing it as much as we can, asking the questions. I think the right does need to organize better, but the kind of organization that I describe in this book is not the kind of organization I'd like to see the right do. I don't think, like, there are some levels of advocating with the administrative state that I think are good and healthy. There's something called the Administrative Procedures Act, by which people can, whenever the federal government issues a final rule, they have to take into consideration public comment. And so what a lot of organizations will do is garner their supporters to send public comment on a particular federal rule or, move there. I think that's a very positive way that nonprofits on both the right and the left can have an impact in government that is not nefarious. Because essentially what they're doing is saying, look, public, you should comment. And that's what it exists for. But I would prefer the system to be changed such that the administrative state was not effectively making law in the way that they do.
I think that makes sense. So there are times I go back and forth between thinking, okay, either the whole system needs to change, or we've got to get much better at playing ball and being willing to foul the other team when they foul us, to go with the basketball analogy. But that's really that's probably not the best way to think about politics. Looking through my list of questions, we have one more. One area we haven't talked about much. You have a chapter that's dealing with what struck me as sort of a form of lawfare against conservatives. They're weaponizing the Justice Department against conservatives. Run us through what you found in kind of looking at that particular area.
Oh my, yeah. Well, that is the most, that is the most terrifying probably chapter of the book. Just because this is where my research on the Southern Poverty Law Center directly coincides with this book in particular, because one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I saw these left-wing organizations impacting the federal government in ways that I think are nefarious. And the Southern Poverty Law Center is pretty much exhibit A of that. Not only, so this was one of the big stories I uncovered, I think it was last year. Margaret Huang, who is the president and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who, by the way, now is facing demands for her to resign from the Southern Poverty Law Center's union, because the SPLC is a nonprofit that is unionized. And the reason they unionized is because of a big scandal in 2019 that I could go on and on about. But in any case, Margaret Huang was bragging to their donors that the Biden administration, as soon as they came in, started going to the Southern Poverty Law Center for advice on countering the domestic terrorism threat. Mm-hmm. And that should set off alarm bells for anybody who is, right of Karl Marx, because the SPLC stock in trade is this map that plots conservative and really dissenting organizations alongside Ku Klux Klan chapters. And the SPLC gained its reputation by suing Klan chapters into bankruptcy. So the SPLC is seen as this vaunted civil rights organization that defeated the Klan in court. And when you look at the hate map, they're suggesting that these organizations are similarly hateful to the Klan. These are organizations like the Family Research Council, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, organizations like the Center for Immigration Studies that, of course, advised former President Trump on his immigration policy, the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And most recently now, not only have they put organizations of doctors who dissent from gender ideology on the hate map, but they also put an openly gay organization on the hate map, Gays Against Groomers, and they branded an anti-LGBTQ hate group. So, these people hate themselves or something. That's what the
ideologically inconsistent. I mean, but also consistent in a weird way. Like that's bizarre.
But like, if you dissent from gender ideology, from critical race theory, from all these noxious ideas on the left that we call woke, then you're liable to find yourself on a map with chapters of the Klan. And now that the Biden administration has been listening to the SPLC, you're liable for the federal government to go after you because you are hateful and therefore like a domestic terror threat. So like we will remember in 2021 when the Department of Justice, it was a convoluted story, but the school boards, the National School Boards Association, the NSBA, sent a letter to the White House and corresponded with the White House before this letter was sent, saying people protesting school boards are a domestic terror threat.
Sure.
And then the Department of Justice sent a memo acting on that. The NSBA later apologized. It was this big scandal. But that whole situation showed that people at federal law enforcement agencies are willing to consider parents who disagree with COVID lockdowns, who disagree with critical race theory in schools, as something of a domestic terror threat. And then, the Southern Poverty Law Center was advising a high-ranking official at the Department of Education and people at the FBI and the Department of Justice. They had a meeting where they went over the hate map, the very same hate map I'm talking about that's been discredited, that, a former SPLC employee said it was a fundraising scam. So this hate map that is smearing conservatives, and by the way, it's not, I like to mock it, but it's also not a laughing matter. In 2012, there was a terrorist who used this hate map to target the Family Research Council for a mass shooting. And now the federal government is meeting with the organization. The federal law enforcement is scheming with this organization. And, the last part of that chapter is all about the organizations pushing the Department of Justice to prosecute pro-lifers under the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, where we've seen the Biden administration prosecute pro-lifers and essentially look the other way when pro-abortion vandals are attacking pro-life pregnancy centers, which under the text of the FACE Act are also protected. So, you have all these ways. There isn't a clear, we don't have people at hate groups getting arrested yet just because they dissent from the left's ideology. But the way that this ideology is being pushed in the federal government, it is not outside of the realm of possibility to see some leader of an organization like Alliance Defending Freedom or the Family Research Council get visited by federal law enforcement in an effort to silence them from opposing the government's preferred narrative, a preferred narrative that goes against not only traditional Christian doctrine, but against basic biological fact. And now the apparatus is coming into place where they can enforce this ideology. And I mean, it's essentially a war of religion on those who don't think that a man can become a woman and vice versa.
Well, as we're coming down to a close for this episode, I think it's fitting to go back to where we started. You mentioned that today is Constitution Day. I've lost track of how many years we have been operating as a country underneath the Constitution, but we're well past 2 centuries. And it does seem appropriate to me to go back to the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers in the sense of how much those documents display an ongoing debate and a willingness to engage in dialogue. I'm currently teaching an American civics class, and we're talking tomorrow about one of the anti-federalist papers that was terrified about the idea of a singular national government functioning as a tyranny. That reality, and of course the right authors of the Constitution won the debate. We have a Constitution, we have a federal government, but that possibility certainly still exists. And I appreciate the work you've done to put this book together. I'm looking forward to it coming out, getting to see the whole thing and kind of look at the whole argument throughout the book. But I appreciate you kind of putting all that together, because it takes a mix of things that kind of hopefully everybody should remember. Most people won't, but everyone should remember. But then pairs it with the knowledge of somebody who's been watching these events very carefully for several years out of DC. I mean, I assume you're aware of this, but the folks who live inside the DC Beltline have a different awareness of some of these factors. And those of us who are out in the rest of the country, we just don't pay nearly as much attention to. So you're bringing all that together in a compelling narrative that hopefully will help us all appreciate some of the ways that our system is currently broken and some of the ways that it could be better. And maybe as one last Constitution note, it does remind me why a Bill of Rights that at least articulates on paper the freedom of speech, the freedom from Congress making any rules on the establishment of religion or the practice thereof, freedom of assembly, all of these things are enshrined in the highest document of our country. And it does hopefully mean that there's still plenty of ground to be able to push back against some of these groups that are really working to undermine the American way of life. Tyler, thank you so much for coming on the Optimistic Curmudgeon today.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Josh. I remember you in college when you were a monarchist.
Once upon a time, man. Yep. I was. I still call myself a theoretical absolute monarchist, but some of that has just been tempered by spending 10 years in education and realizing that I'm probably more of a functional aristocrat at this point. I want, but I also want an aristocracy of the competent. So there it is. But once upon a time, I was a very avid fan of absolute monarchy. That's true. Well, thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today here on the Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Tyler O'Neill of the Daily Signal, and the book is The Woketopus: The Dark Money Cabal Manipulating the Federal Government.
You've been listening to another episode of the Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. Thank you to America's Christian Credit Union for sponsoring this episode. Listeners, if you want to let me know what you thought about the episode, or if you too want to sponsor an episode, please message me on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Just search for the Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.